Me today is Arn Menconi, who's running for Colorado Senate District 8. Thank you, Arn, for being with me tele-remotely. First off, can you give us a brief introduction of who you are and why you're deciding to run for Colorado Senate District 8?
Sure. Thank you, John, and thank you, Our Revolution, Colorado Springs, and whoever else is watching. It's May 8th, and I jumped into this race right before the pandemic started to just rear its head, although I was writing about it and talking about it. I have been a two-term Eagle County Commissioner, and that was between 2001 and 2009. I also started a youth outreach charity in 1993 it was at the time called Snowboard Outreach Society. It later started to take on skiing, summer sports, camping, mountain biking, climbing, and we turned it into I turned it into a social justice leadership program over 21 years and grew it nationally. And I had a dean from Harvard, NYU, GW on my board, CEOs on my board, and I have an MBA from University of Denver. I've lived in Colorado in the high country, mostly in the what's considered the Vail Valley for 25 years, and then over here in Garfield for 5 years. 60 years old, grew up on the south side of Chicago, learning about racism, about the Vietnam War. My first memory was Jack Kennedy being killed, then it was Martin Luther King, then it was his brother, it was Malcolm X. So that was sort of a backdrop that I grew up near steel mills, and when I made it out to Vail, Colorado, I thought I hit the lottery. And I also thought that I couldn't run any farther from reality. And so I started to figure out a way to give back. When I was a commissioner, I really had to give back. And it was a day-to-day job because we weren't really that blue of a county at the time. It was mostly a red county. I had hair halfway down my back. I was 40 years old, and I beat a multimillionaire Republican because I worked my ass off. And I talked about just sensible things that people, at the time it seemed like a million years ago compared to today. Then I ran this charity for 21 years, and I started to get very political. I've always been rebel. I've always gotten in trouble. They tried to recall me twice when I was a county commissioner. Once for saying we shouldn't go to Afghanistan. That was only 18 years ago. And then the other time was for funding early child care development. Governor Ritter has put me on some amazing boards for health and human services. I've been on national levels for early child care development. I've sat on statewide water boards. I've fought to have some of the most forward-thinking, affordable housing codes. Passed the open space initiative in Eagle County and saved tens of thousands of open space. So from that local experience and growing up, and becoming more aware and meeting senators and Congress people who were raising money in the Vail Valley, and knowing Jared Polis before he ever got elected, and Mark Udall and I used to hang out, and Ken Salazar and all that. But there was this sort of burning bush experience when I lost my job because I was speaking out against Palestine, and I was saying we can't get a little pregnant and go back into Iraq in 2014. And this isn't something I talked about much publicly. But this is not a free country. You do not have a First Amendment right of free speech. You speak out against the wrong things like Palestine, and you lose the best job in the world running a national snowboard charity for disadvantaged kids. So I spent a lot of time in D.C. and New York, and I became friends with whistleblowers and with people like Code Pink, and marched in and did 6 Black Lives Matter laydowns, and worked with the president of the Black Bar Association. And I had this unbelievable experience for several years. And I jumped into the Green Party. I left the Democratic Party to run against Michael Bennet because I had campaigned for Michael Bennet. And I watched him change and me change and me become woke. And so I got him to come out against the TPP. I got him to be in favor of the Iran deal by just being that kind of wedge voter in the Green Party. And I hung out with, a lot of interesting people, policymakers. The Green Party I'm not a big fan of anymore. I saw it become very destructive. But Jill Stein was a policy kind of, genius almost. And it was great to learn under her and campaign statewide. 2 years ago, I ran for U.S. Congress because the kids in Stoneman, Douglas, demanded that adults grow up. And I came out against AR-15s, ban on handguns, demanded a ban on fracking, and demanded impeaching Donald Trump. Those were my three main points, along with the Green New Deal, which I started running on in 2014, and universal health care in 2014, and trying to get a statewide initiative to raise minimum wage to $15 an hour. So to wrap it up, I thought, after that congressional race, I'm not doing this anymore. I'm fried, I'm burnt out. I've been arrested 5 times. I've been up to Standing Rock, and I'm kind of feeling like I can't move the needle. I wrote a lot of articles on climate change. I met Greta Thunberg. I met Jane Goodall. I've worked kind of with Paul Hawkins. Josh Fox endorsed me. I got really involved in the climate change movement. I met AOC in Washington, D.C., Joe Neguse in October. Ralph Nader was going to bring me on to try to bring legislation for climate change. So that's a long way of saying that it kind of feels like all roads have kind of led to, wow, I'm not going to run anymore. Climate change is going to destroy us. And a campaign manager saying to me, you should run for Senate District 8. And I'm like, I'm not running for anything ever again except away from the United States, unless I can win it. No more like that was great. We moved the movement. And so what he said is, I can show you a pathway to victory. I didn't think anyone was jumping into the race at the time. The guy jumped in. I know him well. I ran against him for U.S. Congress. Carl Hanlon. It was also Dianne Mintz-Bush. We got along very well, but he's a moderate. He's gotten backed by the Democratic moderates. 5 state senators have endorsed him. He's gotten endorsed by 2 representatives. He's got the bling bling, but he doesn't have the ideas. He doesn't have the hard work. He's never had to win an election before. I had to win 2 hard-fought elections in Eagle County. Those were really hard to do. I've raised money. I've gotten volunteers. We're about 57 days out from a primary. It's going to be a real competitive primary, and whoever wins this primary is maybe going to become the next state senator. So I got in this because, well, let's use a very crude example. I got arrested in January screaming at Polis and the Democrats at the state capitol with the Extinction Rebellion group that I was with, and with the Sunrise Movement, saying ban fracking now, because I'm beyond frustrated listening to speeches and talking about how we're going to do something and never see something called a bill out of a lawmaker whose job is to write laws to fix problems. So I thought I can do that, kind of like the AOC of Colorado, like I was before there was AOC, and how I campaigned on Green New Deal before the Sunrise Movement took it. But it's inspiring. Now we're realizing Bernie's out of the race, and that was another reason I jumped in. I thought I'd be in Milwaukee protesting at the convention, and I wanted to do it from a state Senate perch, but he's now out of the race. And I'm not, and I think Andrew Romanoff, I sit on his environmental policy making team. I've known Andrew since 2005. Before he jumped in the race, I texted him, said, if you jump in, I will work for you. I fucked up by backing Michael Bennett, and I owe you. You helped me out. And the same thing with Dianne Mintz-Bush.
Yeah, I think
I didn't get into issues that I'm trying to promote, but I'm sorry, I was taking way too much time explaining that.
No, it was good. I mean, I think it's good to have a good history of kind of who you are and what you represent. And I think you brought up several, really good points. One thing that you mentioned was how a lot of politicians really are, they say the right thing, or almost, they kind of talk the talk, but they don't actually walk the walk. I look back at like the Democratic debates for this last seems like forever ago, but everyone would say like, oh yeah, we need to rejoin the Paris Climate Agreement, which is like, well, duh, that's like a given, but that doesn't do anything. We need concrete action. Like, what specifically are you trying to do to address this crisis that affects my generation, affects their grandchildren's generation, but they don't say anything because they don't want to upset the corporate interests and the interests that back them. So I guess my question is ultimately like, what are your proposals? Like, you mentioned supporting the Green New Deal. Like, what specifically, like, concrete actions are you referring to when you say you want?
Right. Well, you guys are more into the policy side than most people, and we're very aligned because I stole a lot of stuff from Bernie, and I've a lot from what Ralph Nader had done. So when you look at it, you think environmental. There's maybe this is a little too big picture, but I used to say when I was campaigning for a federal race, we're run by the global corporate mafia. That's a Chris Hedges line kind of thing. He said we have, we have an inverse totalitarian state, and it's run by, that was his mentor. And he had Sheldon Walden said that. And so I worked with Daniel Ellsberg, I worked with Lawrence Wilkerson, and they'd say, we're an empire in decline. And what empires do in decline is they take everything. And then I once said to Daniel Ellsberg, the first whistleblower at his home, I spent there 10 days with him, and he shaped me 5 years ago. And he said, it's not the military industrial complex. It's whatever the business interest is of the U.S. government. So another person who he worked with a lot, who used to advise presidents on security briefings every morning, said it's the military. It's if you broke it down, you have the financial industry, the oil and gas industry, big pharma, big agriculture, insurance agencies, and a very big influence in foreign policy with APEC or with the pro-Zionist movement. And so what I think of is, okay, if I'm constructing policy, which is, most people do not like to watch policy being made. There's an old joke, there's two things you don't let your kids watch. One is sausage being made, and the other is policy being made. But you have to have your fundamental values as to what you're trying to do. And your fundamental value is you're thinking about, well, yes, socialism is a redistribution of the channels of production where government should and could provide. So healthcare, that one's easy. Oh, expand something that already exists in every other country but ours, or expand of Medicaid for all. People got that. If it's Green New Deal, what you're saying is, look, the IPCC report said we have 8 years left. I now have charge, if I'm being a representative and a leader, to say we have 8 years to get ourselves off of fossil fuels. And it's in the area of energy, which is taking fossil fuels and drawing them down over 5 years. I think it's almost impossible in an oil and gas state. It's about taking buildings, both commercial and residential, and making them net zero over a period of time. It's taking transportation, if it's cars, buses, trucks, trains, those type of things, and converting them over to energy efficiency. And so what I would like to see, and then there's other issues, but to give you an example, you get 5 bills you can introduce as a state legislator. We're going to watch the decimation of the state budget. So they're going to be talking austerity, austerity, austerity. And I want to be talking about wealth tax, and I forget the third thing. And I want to make it off of real estate that is $5 million or more. So people could start to expand their idea that, oh my God, we don't have to listen to this bullshit about belt tightening, which is going to cut services that are holding the fabric of community together. So you have to try to figure out, okay, what can I do with 5 bills? I've already promised one that I would do on immigration reform of whatever is out there that is the low-hanging fruit, because you got to figure out what committees you are on. You got to figure out whether or not they're going to look at me like, you were screaming at us and got arrested for saying ban fracking now. We don't want to work with radicals. We're moderates. We work with Republicans and don't do anything. We believe in incrementalism. And so what I would want to do there, more diplomatically, is say to progressives in Colorado, I have this bill, I can't seem to get it moved. Could be prison reform. Okay, could be raising minimum wage. It can't be too far out there that it doesn't get any, where it just looks like Don Quixote tilting at windmills. But I've talked to Daniel, I've talked to Andrew Romanoff, the type of bills that could be passed. I talked to Jonathan Singer. I talked to Senator Kathleen Aguilar, because I was really big in campaigning on Amendment 69, as to what do you think could be kind of introduced that would be, well, here's the safe little things, maybe we could just put teeth in Senate Bill 181 that is still, the one about fracking, oil and gas, trying to make it shifting over to health and safety, that is supposed to give power to the state government to maybe kind of like put a control and stop fracking in some way, shape or form, but it's not. It was just used to kind of kick the can down the road. We've had 2,000 fracking sites. So what I think about it, I have like 8 initiatives. This is like playing policy bingo. You talk to any politician running in the western slope of Colorado who's a Democrat, they're going to talk about affordable health care. They're going to talk about affordable housing, something with regards to the environment. What's really big to people up here is preserving water quantity in the Colorado River, making sure it's not stolen by the Front Range development and all the people moving to the Front Range, because this is the mouth of the Colorado River. And so what I try to get people to understand is those snow-capped mountains are melting, just like they are forecasted in the Himalayas, where 150 million people aren't going to have quality water by 2050, and try to keep bringing this up in order to taking the governor's initiative to be, I forget what if it's like net zero emission by 2040, and say, well, that's great, but that's an aspirational goal. How are we going to actually put it into law so people could see it? So I talked about the environment, water quality, quantity, education. I'm very well versed in early child care development. I've sat on national boards. I think that's very important. When you talk about Green New Deal, you're talking about climate justice. When you're talking about climate justice and for frontline people and for communities of color, you're always talking about how do you raise the social safety net in housing, in some kind of healthcare benefits. Maybe there's opportunities in trying to do where we're not holding people in incarceration for so long while they're waiting for their bail. I was in jail and I talked to all sorts of people in 24 hours who are being held for way too long on frivolous charges, things like that. And then I'd like to really get on the Joint Budget Committee so I know how they're playing sort of like shell game with the budget. We don't have it, we have it, we don't have it. So those are the areas. That's how I would tack it too.
Yeah, I think that's a pretty good approach. Another question that I have, because Colorado's Senate District 8 it's pretty rural. I'm curious about how, as a really strong progressive, how does this type of messaging appeal to like people in the on the western side of Colorado?
Yeah. Well, you have the counties to just go through them and also talk about a pathway to victory. You need about 6,500 votes to win the primary, and you need about 40,000 votes to win the general. This county, this district has never been won, to my knowledge, and it used to be part of Eagle County, by a Democrat. And even when I was getting elected, I had to wear like cowboy boots and a cowboy hat once in a while, and talk about, oh, shucks, and go to the 4-H stuff and all that kind of stuff. But I think what has shifted a lot is you have Summit County. So you have Garfield County, which it's sort of, we'll call it schizophrenic. You have some people who are the part that's Glenwood Springs, Rifle, Carbondale. It's the only place you could hope to really win. You go further west than that, and you might as well go to Utah if you're a Democrat. And then you have Summit County, which is Bernie did great in all of these counties. He won all of these counties, so that's good for a primary. Summit County is considered very blue. Routt County is sort of kind of bluish, that's Steamboat. And then it gets very rural. Jackson in the primary, Jackson County, which is north of Grand, had 55 votes in the last primary for the Democratic race. Garfield County had 4,200. So Grand County is, the Democrats said they're very pro, I've checked this out, very pro Romanoff, and then you have Rio Blanco and Mafia, and that's where fracking and coal and things like that are. So the primary message would be, I'm the progressive, he's the moderate, there's a clear choice. I've won 2 hard-fought elections. He hasn't won an election before. And I have real experience in real results in legislation. And I have, in the general, it would be kind of like, well, I'm going to kind of broaden out the story. I may not be talking about Green New Deal. I'm going to be talking about shifting and transitioning jobs from oil and gas, because they're losing. I mean, they're pulling up stake as we speak. This is not news to anybody. The Republicans told them that Democrats were going to cost them their job. The Republicans facilitated them running it right off the cliff, their jobs. So talk about, if depending what campaigning would be like, if it was more like coffees and meet and greets and forums where I could actually reach out, I can use some of my dry sense of humor as a snowboarder guy who grew up in Chicago and say, I've pissed off as many Democrats as I have Republicans. I'm not one to mess around. It's not just that I'm passionate. It's I don't like somebody faking left and running right. I don't like it when somebody tells me they're going to do something and they can't. I want to tell you what it looks like. You're smart. You're industrious in your own area where I'm not. And this is how we're going to have to lean into government. Yeah. And I think that's West Slope, they always go in there with this, we're independent. We moved up here because we're rugged individualists. We like to jump off of shit and, like try to kill ourselves, whatever it is, and I've done all of that and just say, look, hey, we're getting hosed.
Yeah, I mean, that's the message that I've seen too, especially in the last, definitely if you've been following politics in the last decade, you start to see this shift where both parties are being represented by or representing the same corporate class. It doesn't matter if Democrat or Republican. Democrats, obviously, they have less of a racist sort of message, but I would argue that their racism is just better hidden because they still don't necessarily always support policies that help, the working class and work minorities in this country. So, they're not as, in your face about it, but when it comes down to it, they don't want to, a lot of moderate Democrats don't want to support policies that, benefit working people and benefit people in rural communities and benefit people in urban communities. So I can understand how a lot of people kind of get disinterested with politics. Like they don't want to be part of any party. In El Paso County, the number one strongest rise is in unaffiliates. It's not in Democrats or Republicans, it's unaffiliates. People are sick of both parties. So I think running as someone who, doesn't necessarily care about the label. I mean, you ran for a Green Party, you're running for Democrat. It's really about your principles and what you care about. I think that's it's being true to yourself, and I think that appeals to people, especially people who have been getting, overlooked and getting kind of walked on their entire lives. So one other question too, this being in Senate District 8, you mentioned, like the lack, the lack of like healthcare in that area. And with the COVID situation, I always really worry most about like rural communities and communities that don't actually have access or as quick of access to, medical supplies and hospitals. And I'm curious about what your stances on that or how you would combat that sort of crisis.
Well, I was on a call today, for example, with a group of people from the Western Slope who gather on a regular basis and talk about the issues of healthcare. I was endorsed by the woman who ran for state Senate for Senate District 8 in 2016 and 2012. So she's been giving me her assistance by endorsing me, telling me to get, here's a committee you could hang on in so you could hear about the kind of questions that you're just asking. Medicaid is going to be cut by the JVC. This is now being reported in the news. We talked about that. Bennett's office got in and talked about something he's trying on a federal basis. And what people kind of fail to think about is rural Colorado gets hit pretty disproportionately because we have less competition in healthcare. Therefore, prices are much higher, insurance is much higher, and like you said, the distances to go are even more difficult. And then you have a lot of undocumented people working either in construction, in the tourism industry, in the farming industry, and in the ranching industry. And that's very difficult for them to sometimes figure out how to negotiate that. I'm personally on Medicaid for me and my children. We've been on food stamps in the last couple of years. We've been on, temporary assistance for needy family. Again, something I don't put out there publicly, but on a smaller group. I mentioned, as a former county commissioner with an MBA, this is a very, very difficult labyrinth to negotiate. It's not just because, I can barely figure this stuff out on how to apply for it all and trying to know all of these services. So what you're supposed to kind of continue with the vein of your question is not necessarily make rural Colorado look like the redheaded stepchild or the victim next to poor and minority in Denver and Colorado Springs and Pueblo. I've campaigned all over the state, so I see all that. But make sure that when they do cuts, if it's to universities or vocational schools, it'll really hit hard up in rural Rio Blanco with their community colleges up there. I'm talking to people like that. And again, this is all about trying to find money. And we're not going to find money in the next 2, 3, 4 years. We have a fivefold problem. We have a healthcare problem or a pandemic. That's going to take 2 or 3 years. We have an economic problem where we're going to watch library districts, school districts, vital services, teachers laid off, police laid off, firefighters laid off, because they're either getting money from sales tax or they're getting money from oil and gas revenues, all these things. So you got to be in there and you've got to be very creative and experienced by saying, wait, I'm not going to believe this is complicated. We can't do anything about it. Wring our hands, which is what a lot of politicians do. Talk about this is what we're fighting for. This is how we're going to figure out how to not cut up the pie, but increase the size of the pie. Did that feel like it answered most of your question?
Yeah, no, I think like it's always difficult, especially as someone who's always lived in a bigger city, and I haven't necessarily had the direct experience of living in a rural community. And I understand, yeah, it's definitely one of those problems that is difficult to solve because, again, it's one of those things that politicians typically say but don't actually do anything about. Because, and if you're running for, a state position, you don't necessarily need all the votes in the rural communities. You need the votes in the city community, cities and areas. So,
well, where it usually gets brought up a lot, reminding what you're talking about, remind me as a county commissioner, like what bubbles up, kind of stuff, mental health, and trying to make sure that service is in these wraparounds and that if somebody needs help, you can refer them. Those are the areas where everybody has mapped out how to increase the concentric circles so that you can help bring in more, we'll call it social safety net, right? But the big thing that I'm always reminding myself is, hey man, this is complicated. There's no money. Don't make it sound like, well, again, this is why I go back to policy bingo. Yeah, I can hit all of the high notes and all of that kind of stuff, but show me, let's use something that was just, let me pick on, a progressive like Emily Sirota or, who else was, but whoever was pushing the paid sick leave, well, that sounds like any progressive's like, hey man, that's just a normal no-brainer, right? They didn't even introduce it. Why? Because coronavirus came in and it stripped out all the small businesses and they're like, I'm not going to put any more burden on businesses right now. Kind of seems sort of kind of possibly right. Okay, what happened to the public option bill that they were going to present? They had it was going to be introduced. They're going to go back to session, I believe, May 18th for 2 weeks. Well, that got taken off the table. Why? Because there was a great idea, phenomenal idea. It was a fiscal note attached to it, and Dems were leadership was telling people like Dylan Roberts, who's endorsed my opponent, who's introduced the bill along with Carrie Donovan, who I've known since she was 14, who's a state senator, and they said, we're pulling it because there's a fiscal note attached to it. We're not going to bring in anything. Now, what you're set up with is like, wait a minute, in the middle of a pandemic, the first thing you want to do is make sure that you're bringing healthcare services across the board so that not everybody's getting sick. They're able to go in and get, but again, it's hard to do unless you have somebody who's saying this is a fucking emergency. We need an emergency tax right now. Call it a wealth tax. Debruce for 5 years. It doesn't have to be permanent. We're not asking for a blank check. And there's something called a rainy day fund that we have too. Yeah. Are we going to pull into what does it take? I mean, Tabor allows us to raise taxes in an emergency.
Yeah. And it's one of those things like, I can't really imagine a more perfect scenario with the amount of unemployment, and that means the lack of people having health care for using some emergency funds. So with that, I think we're running close to being out of time. I just want to give you any opportunity to cover anything that we might have not gotten to, or just kind of, I guess, play us out.
I think what I'll go with is what I've been learning in the last couple of weeks that I couldn't have thought. I was like, when I ran for U.S. Senate, I knew kind of, sort of, but I was shocked that there was no media covering Michael Bennet and the other guy. So whether or not they were talking about something good or bad, you weren't going to hear about it. Okay. There's no investing. No one's paying attention to state Senate races. Okay. As a guy who gave Bernie money in 2015, who tried to be his field operator for the state of Colorado in 2015, I kind of know that progressives are more few and far between than we really like to think we are on Facebook. And there's only maybe, I bet you could count on less than one hand the real progressives that can win a race. Okay. There are people who are great progressives running for state Senate right now, but they're in almost impossible races. Okay. I'm in a race that's over in less than, say, 6 weeks. So we need help, because I've jumped on a hand grenade, a guy who's unemployed on unemployment insurance with Medicaid and food stamps, saying, throw me a life raft, progressives. Okay. I need help getting attention to what I'm doing here. I'm making phone calls every day to raise money from my friends in the middle of a pandemic. Okay. So let's play smart. Let's play clever. And if you like what I have to say, if you think I've earned your support and you can help get other support, I could use this, because I have to tell these stories, because this race boils down to something so I would have never guessed. Mailers. There's no other way to get name recognition in, we're not exactly the Boondocks, but we are, except for mailers. And I also have about 5 volunteers who are going to make about 500 to 1,000 calls a week while I'm dialing for dollars. And I got to raise 20 grand to do 3 mailers. And what yes, I can do all the other pieces, press releases, Zoom forums, whatever they have us do, right? But this is how simple it is, because my campaign manager and the ones who are advising me worked on great campaigns. Andrew Romanoff's campaign manager, Tara, has been advising me, and they always can tell me, shut up, make phone calls, raise money, get your name out there.
Yeah,
So,
it's how it goes sometimes.
and they're like, I know you want to talk policy, and I know that Andrew likes to talk policy, and I know that Diamond Bush likes to talk policy, but that's not going to get you elected. What's going to get you elected is your field game and raising money. So that's all I have to share with you that I think is the reality check.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it makes sense. I mean, it's kind of the unfortunate thing about modern politics is there's a lot of that's something that our chapter in particular is just is along with our revolution as a national syndicate is really trying to focus on, as well as money in politics and the negative effect that can have, especially when they're going against corporate interests and people who have a lot more financial backing. So. And your website is arnmenconi.com. Is that correct?
My website is arnmenconi.com. My
Awesome.
email is arnmenconi.com. And
Awesome.
that website's getting an overhaul. That was just something quickly put together. Perfect. So I've raised $5,000. I've gotten money from about 125 people. My competitors raised a little over $8,000, and he had about 40. So, and what kind of ties back into this is sort of a resentment. No, it is a resentment. Is I reached out to Joe Salazar a gazillion times, know him very well, had breakfast with him a lot, etc. Been on the campaign trail with him. Can't get his endorsement. If I went after Emily Sirota, it'd probably be impossible to get hers. And I think my opponent has a line out the door of endorsements. Probably never met these people, never worked with them, never got arrested before, never was up in Standing Rock, never passed all these things, and they're endorsing him. Endorsements don't make a huge difference, but they do matter. It does show that you're organizing yourself, and a leader with no followers is a walk in the park. So by yourself. So it's nice if you guys, as we talked about in the past, can maybe broaden out and see if other people are revolution, and maybe we could even tee this up. And hopefully I'm going to, pull off this primary. It's going to be a real close race. And then we can get our revolution to help me with the general. Yeah,
for sure. I mean, I think there's already talk. It's tough to get national endorsements for sure. I mean, national, anyway, what I'm going to do is I'm going to record a closing and then go back to this, just because it's probably something on the official video. So anyway, thank you, Arn, for speaking with us today. Look forward to seeing the outcome of the primary and hopefully continue on into the actual election. So the primary is June 30th. Is that correct?
Yes.
Awesome. Great. Thank you.
Thank you so much.